we want to tell you about another podcast from PRX called Monumental. This podcast explores questions about the past, present, and future of U.S. monuments, uncovering the stories about what and who is important, as well as the stories that have been left out. Join host Ashley Seaford across the country with their team of journalists. Listen wherever you get your podcasts.
Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avirgan. And this is Media Environment Week. I just came up with that name. But basically, as listeners to this show know, throughout the election year, we've been checking in from time to time on some of the big themes of an election season. And we've done October surprises and VPs and debates and so forth. And we are kind of in this little stretch where we're doing a number of episodes that try to help us understand how we got to this current media environment. We had Josh Levine to talk about the early days of Fox News. Last weekend on our 2024 analysis special on Sunday, we talked about the very different media bubbles that the current campaigns are operating in, from podcast interviews to social media and more. And now let's go back and trace a little bit of the history of political advertising and specifically TV advertising, which was the dominant way that politicians advertised up until, I guess, pretty recently. But it is still obviously a huge force. No surprise, in these final weeks of the race, political ads are running rampant. And those of you who are listening from one of the 7 swing states will certainly agree with what I'm saying and feel that fatigue. There is more than $10 billion being spent on ads across all media platforms. That is up 13% from 2020, which is a year, mind you, when most people were kind of stuck at home just staring into screens. And so that was a huge year for advertising anyway. And we're still up 13 to 15% from that. And of course, it isn't just TV and print ads anymore, but it's online ads, social campaigns, micro-targeting, as we discussed, all of that stuff. But let's focus on the history of TV ads, how the world of political TV ads was developed, then perfected, then turned extremely negative. And then we will bring it to now and ask, does anyone really own a TV anymore? And what's the point of a TV ad? But here, as always, Nicole Hemmer of Vanderbilt and Kelly Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hello, Jody.
Hey there.
We will trace this history kind of through the 50s and 60s and into the 70s and 80s, which is where a lot of this stuff got perfected. And then it sort of really flourished into the mid-2000s. And then, there's this larger question of what's the point of a TV ad now? But I have some thoughts on that. And there's still tons of money being spent on that. But let's go back to the very beginning, early 50s, obviously rise of the medium itself. But when do politicians start to say, okay, here's a medium that we need to try and perfect with our messaging?
I mean, it's early. It's like 1952, where Rasa Reeves, who's this ad executive, basically comes up with this idea to start pitching political campaigns in the same way that you would think of TV commercials. Reeves is the guy who's responsible for the slogan, like, melts in your mouth, not in your hand. Like,
for M&Ms.
Yeah, for M&Ms. And he's like, we can do the same thing for politicians. And so he pretty much pitches Eisenhower and creates this political campaign that comes out in 1952. It looks terrible. It looks like,
you're bringing your 2024 lens to it. Come on, it blew people's minds.
It's not even that. Like it's so. People mocked these ads as feeling very like used car salesman, very either sort of just corny or like we might call it cringe today, but. It's of Eisenhower trying to look every bit presidential. He is the ultimate soldier. He is sort of like, there's like a sound bites of his speeches that are being played throughout the commercial. And then you see, footage of him either marching or meeting with world leaders and sort of like, he's your guy that can solve your problems. And people didn't receive it that well. People were kind of like, what is this?
Yeah.
Well, it's something brand new. And I show these ads to my students. And one of the things that I talk about is that idea that, first of all, 1952, not that many Americans have television. Plenty do for these to be something that's useful, but it's nothing like it would be by the 1960s. And so they don't necessarily bring a well-developed set of expectations to what a television ad is going to look like. And so you have these basically Mad Men at the height of Madison Avenue, when slogans and jingles are being used to sell cereal and soap, and now politicians, and you get a lot of those same techniques. And so you do get these short television ads like Eisenhower Answers America that really they're like 15 to 20 seconds, and the substance in them is somewhere between 0 and 5%. Like it's so you have it. So like a sample Eisenhower Answers America ad would be like this man saying, very much like today, eggs are so expensive today, and Eisenhower comes on and he's like, my Mamie tells me the very same thing. We should lower prices. And you're like, well, that's not a plan. That's just saying I don't like inflation, which, we hear a lot today as well. But, I think that sometimes we have this idea of like, past politics being so much more substantive. And you look at that ad, or you look at like the jingles where it's just like, I like Ike sing for 1 minute straight. Yes. And you're like, oh, okay. I get why people are criticizing this.
Well, also like, Ike's not an actor. Do you know what I mean? He's kind of awkward. And one of the kind of funny things about the ad is that, like, he couldn't really read the sort of lines very well because they didn't want him to wear glasses. And so, like, you can kind of tell he's struggling just to get through the ad. It's, if you can't make it feel authentic, I think that's a big part of it.
Yeah. Adlai Stevenson, who was in that race too, refused to do TV ads and sort of said, like, we're not trying to sell the presidency, like we're selling cereal. And so, I think...
and he lost.
History passed Stevenson by in many ways.
I was going to say, how'd that work out for you, Adelaide?
But, like, I think this is maybe an obvious statement, but, like, these early attempts, you can tell that they don't fully understand the power of the medium. And that's sort of the story of TV in the 50s, and the big leaps in the 50s are the sort of people who really kind of understand the medium itself. But, it feels like a little bit of a Frankenstein of like, okay, a little man on the street interview thing mashed together with a jingle, mashed together with Ike staring into the camera and squinting and saying a line, and we're just going to kind of like mash all those together and it's going to be a campaign ad, as opposed to something that we'll get to in a little bit that like feels like, oh gosh, this is made for this. It understands the power of TV.
Cinematic.
Exactly. Can I just say as an aside, this guy Rosser Reeves, who was the ad exec responsible for a lot of these groundbreaking ads for Eisenhower. Yeah, he did do the melts in your mouth, not in your hand M&M's commercials. I went back and watched some of those. And I mean, it's a very powerful slogan. I think people even now sort of understand what that means. But the ad itself, you ever seen it? It's like a guy sitting at a table and he has two hands that are like balled up.
The correct number.
And he's like, well, he has two hands, but like in each of his hands are balled up. And he's like, inside one is chocolate and inside one is M&Ms. And he's like, I've got it held tightly in my hands. And then he opens it up and it's like, see, the M&Ms didn't melt. But then I'm like, who would do that to themselves? Who would sit there with just plain chocolate in their hands, holding it and let it like, he opens it up and there's like this puddle of melted chocolate. And it's like, is this a thing that Americans are doing?
It like that.
So, but again, I think that probably describes a lot of TV and TV advertising. It's like, let's convince you of a problem that doesn't exist and then offer you a solution for it. It was just very funny. It was just very funny to watch this guy like stand there and display a sort of handful of melted puddly chocolate. But
a common problem we all face.
A common problem we all face. Which, for what it's worth, when you eat M&Ms and your hands are warm, now all of a sudden you just have blue streaks. And
I was about to say, that is not truth in advertising.
I was going to say, you would still have
Ross
a
or Reeves.
rainbow. Yeah,
we thought we knew you. Okay, let's move into the 60s, because it does feel like 1964 election is that moment where people start to really understand the power of this medium and use political advertising to take advantage of that.
Yeah, so this is 1964, and this media consultant, Tony Schwartz, comes up with this campaign ad, famously, or maybe infamously, known as the Daisy ad. And the Daisy ad was for LBJ, and it is maybe a 60-second ad of a little 3-year-old white girl who's in a field, and she's pulling the petals off flowers, and she's counting the petals as she pulls them off, and kind of even miscounting in this
totally
miscounting way. Just like 5, 7, 7. And it's adorable. And then all of the sudden, the frame sort of freezes. It zooms in on her face, particularly her eye. And in the center of her eye, you hear this voiceover. You see an explosion of an atomic bomb going off, and LBJ comes on and says, "These are the stakes. To make a world in which God's children can live or go into the dark, we must either love each other or we must die." Wow. And it's like, damn!
It goes hard.
It's intense.
I showed this ad to my students yesterday, and it was the first time many of them had been seeing it. And when it switches over from that little girl, she gets to like 9 and counting the daisy petals, and then all of a sudden this voice comes on and it says 10.
Oh yes, 9,
the countdown
in reverse. Yeah,
8, and then the atomic bomb goes off, and they just gasp because it is the
Your
most.
Students?
Yes. It's the most like that escalated quickly political ad that you can imagine. And then that voiceover, I mean, Kelly just read it, and that is a wild thing for a political candidate to say. We must either love each other or we must die. Vote President Johnson November 4th. And it's like the number of gasps that the students gave during this commercial, because if you haven't seen it, it is
jarring,
dramatic.
Yeah,
right. And it's dramatic. It's jarring. That language is intense. I mean, he, for all intents and purposes, says like, I'm going to kill this little girl if you don't vote for me. But like,
it was Goldwater's going to kill
that. Well, I guess Goldwater's going to kill this little girl.
If you don't
but basically,
vote.
See that little girl? Like, she might be dead. But which is jarring. But so it's jarring, but it's also powerful because I think it really does understand the medium, and it really is like, the first 80% of the ad doesn't have any dialogue, and it doesn't have any political slogans or any political messaging. It is just emotional, and it's and it's actually like kind of well shot, and you have this slow zoom, and then you have this reflection in her eye, and all that stuff, the way the sound shifts. So it clearly is like artistic in a way that I think has impact. Hey, it's Jody. If you're a longtime listener to Radiotopia, you probably know that we had a podcast that ran from 2016 to 2020 discussing every episode of the show The West Wing. Well, I am so excited to tell you that The West Wing Weekly is back. Joshua Malina, who starred in The West Wing as Will Bailey, and Rishikesh Hirway, creator and host of Song Exploder, have reunited this election season for the West Wing Weekly Political Film Fest. Because watching and discussing art about politics can be a great way to get some perspective on what is happening in the world right now. Something that, if you listen to this show, you also probably appreciate. Each week, Josh and Rishi talk about a different political film with the same mix of analysis and humor that made The West Wing Weekly such a hit. The slate of films they're going to talk about ranges from classics to modern-day masterpieces, Dr. Strangelove, Network, Judas and the Black Messiah, and they're kicking it all off with The American President, which was a film written by Aaron Sorkin that would eventually lead to the creation of The West Wing. So get in on it, join the conversation, attend the virtual political film fest, subscribe to The West Wing Weekly wherever you get your podcasts. In the lead up to the 2024 U.S. elections, more people than ever are wondering how our electoral process actually works. What systems are in place to ensure secure and accurate results? And how can we recognize misinformation and be able to fully participate in our democracy? The new season of Democracy Decoded, a podcast by Campaign Legal Center, covers all of this. You'll learn from top lawyers and democracy's frontline heroes, such as poll workers and civil rights advocates, to understand how our elections function, the potential threats they face, and the checks and balances in place so voters can rest assured that the election results will reflect the will of the people. Because here's the thing, our electoral system works, and Democracy Decoded will help you understand why. Listen now at democracydecoded.org. That's democracydecoded.org, or on your favorite podcast app. And big thanks to Democracy Decoded for sponsoring the show. So my question with the Daisy ad has always been, I think it's hard to overstate the fear of atomic annihilation in the 50s and 60s for a lot of people. And it's, generations of kids who had to do duck and cover drills every week. So how much was this actually sort of reflecting the dire way that Americans felt about these threats?
I think it's a clear reflection of it. I mean, the reason the ad is so powerful is because, we're like a couple years out from the Cuban Missile Crisis. The idea that the United States could be involved in a nuclear war, that the United States could be attacked with nuclear weapons was a live possibility. We don't necessarily think about it now because it didn't happen. But for the people who were living in that moment, this was one of their greatest fears. And Goldwater's sort of cavalier attitude toward nuclear weapons made this ad possible. This ad, which doesn't ever mention Goldwater's name.
Right.
But everyone gets the message.
Sure.
Yeah. And an ad that wasn't shown repeatedly. It was only shown one time. Like,
this is the wildest part of this story to me. Yeah. That ad only aired one time.
Mm-hmm. It only aired one time, and I think it still would have. So it's really the first viral ad that gets most of its shares through earned media. So news coverage of the ad rather than paying to have the ad aired. And one of the reasons this happens is that even though it doesn't mention Goldwater, the very next day Goldwater holds a press conference to denounce the ad, to say that Johnson is engaging in fear-mongering. And that makes it a live political issue in the campaign. And all of these news outlets come and they show the ad and they cover it on the nightly news. And so millions more Americans see this ad than would have ever seen it without it becoming an issue in the campaign.
Nowadays, it would be clipped, put on social media, cable news would rerun it, but were people just describing it to each other? When there was news coverage of it, were they rerunning clips of it? Like, I just literally am fascinated by the idea that it went viral at a time when... With
only shown one time, you mean?
Shown one time in 1964, when it's a little harder for stuff to, like a visual stuff to go viral in that way. Like, it's not like people had it on their phones and could pull it out and show it to someone. So they were describing, like sitting at diners and describing it to each other?
Well, I think they were showing it on the news.
Yeah, as a way of
like, here's what the ad was, here's what these two candidates are talking about. And you have to remember, virality, of course, is very different in the 1950s and 60s. You have 3 news networks. Yeah. And so you have tens of millions of people tuning in to these broadcasts. And so they're seeing it that way because there really is a monoculture. So when it's shown once, you're hitting like a third of the country. And I think that's the way that most people are being exposed to it.
But you're also hitting them multiple times for free when you get news coverage that's basically saying, hey, let's play this again.
And that is, I think, certainly a trick that people have learned in the sort of whole kind of industry of earned media is do something controversial and then just get news coverage to talk about it, say something outrageous, get news coverage to talk about it, and all of a sudden there's a multiplier effect there, even if they're denouncing it. And we certainly have seen people weaponize that over the years.
And I mean, LBJ won. So,
right.
I mean, that's
by a lot.
And this is largely seen as pretty effective, though, right? I mean,
very much so. This is not an ad that hurts Johnson. It's something that hurts Goldwater because it's plausible. Because people are not convinced that Goldwater is someone who has the temperament to run the country. And this is a reminder of what the stakes are. We must love one another or we must die.
What's the counter commercial to that? Do you know what I mean? Like, what alternative does he come up with that would counter that kind of sensationalism? Like, you can't just say, no, I wouldn't. You know, like, you would have to have some sort of commercial that would combat it with the same amount of...
You got to get the same girl. And you make an ad where you're just sitting there at dinner and everyone's safe and happy and you're sort of reading to her and you're like, but she was on the payroll.
My colleague has a theory on this, that if Goldwater, because he's not mentioned in the ad, had responded to the campaign ad and said, oh, you know what? Johnson is right. The issue of nuclear weapons is an important issue in this campaign, and let's use this as a moment to talk about what our different views are and whatever. I don't actually think that would counter it quite as much as my colleague thinks, but that's one way. And the other thing is, I'm not sure if this ever aired, but the Goldwater campaign did cut a very sensationalistic ad that was like, images of black and white people dancing together and drunk driving and kids smoking pot. And it was all like, this is the world that Johnson is going to lead to. Race mixing. So they certainly had their set of issues about disorder and chaos and a particular vision of America that they were playing around with. But, I don't think that ever aired because it had a particularly nasty streak to it that Goldwater wasn't game for.
Yeah. But Kelly, your question about what the response is to something like that, I think gets at this much bigger thing, which is like when you're faced with an opponent who's just going to kind of blow past the existing norms, you kind of can't do anything, right? I mean, it's like, other than try and just sort of reinforce the norms. But if you try and step outside and respond in kind, then all of a sudden all you're doing is just kind of pushing the norms further and further out.
Brinksmanship, mutually assured destruction.
Exactly.
Yeah.
There you go. Yeah. Very apt. I certainly think that this started to sort of expand the idea of how vicious and sort of bombastic political advertising could be. One last thing that's of note, Goldwater, in responding to this ad, says, "The homes of Americans are horrified and the intelligence of Americans is insulted by weird television advertising, which this administration has been using." And I just like that Goldwater was using that word weird much earlier than Tim Walz was in 2024. Trendsetter there. But yes. Okay, everyone, that brings us to the end of part 1 of our tour through the history of political advertising. Next episode, we go into the 70s and 80s and up until now and talk about why there is still so much money being spent on TV ads. I have a little theory about that. Anyway, let us know what you make of this episode or anything else, or any questions or comments or ideas. You can always email us, thisdaypod@gmail.com. My name is Jody Abergan. On behalf of Kelly and Nikki, thanks for listening, and we'll see you soon.
To make a world in which all of God's children can live, or to go into the dark, we must either love each other or we must die.
Vote for President Johnson on November 3rd. The stakes are too high for you to stay home.
Radiotopia from